the 2017 ACM Turing Award and 2022 NAE Charles Stark Draper Prize for Engineering. I now request Professor Patterson to enlighten the audience with the theme of today's talk.
All right, thanks very much. And is this talk slot 1 hour? Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so here's the papers I'm going to be talking about today, and in case you want to go into more depth. So it's going to spend about 5 minutes introducing the tensor processor unit family that was for machine learning, go over the lessons. I'm going to talk about some kind of change course and talk about some of the consequences for machine learning on the environment, and then kind of show you how we can make things a lot better, and then open up for question and answers. Okay. So how did this get started? 10 years ago, Google was kind of an early believer in the magic of deep neural networks, and they calculated that if they rolled it out and 100 million of their customers started using it, they would have to double the data centers if you did machine learning on CPUs. So they started what's called today a domain-specific architecture for the inference phase of machine learning, and it was supposed to be 10 times better than CPUs. And they did it amazingly quickly, that just 15 months from the start of the project to the deployment in data centers because of this emergency. And they exceeded their goals. We later wrote a paper about it, and it was 30 times better than a GPU and 80 times better than a CPU. And then our new CEO, Sundar Pichai, just the following year decided to announce it. And let's see if this works. You can hear the audio. So that announcement was a surprise to everybody. For those of you who know your history, this is a painting of Helen of Troy, and the Trojan Wars were fought over Helen, and a poet said hers was the face that launched 1,000 ships. So what I say about the TPU is it launched 1,000 chips. Intel was caught flat-footed, so it started buying up domain-specific architecture companies, spending billions of dollars, and even deciding they made a mistake and bought another one to replace it. Intel's competitors, hyperscalers, started building their own chips like the TPU V1. And impressively, the venture community invested $3 billion a year over the next 5 years on bits, and with many interesting, very different architectures, trying different ideas to see if that would be really great for that. And then the paper itself already has, I guess, it's 6 years later, it has 4,000 citations, which is a lot. And so you kind of argue that this is possibly the most influential microprocessor since the RISC processors or the Intel Pentium Pro. Okay. So we've announced 5 different products that are based on this. And you can see originally they were for inference, and then the next step was to do training. And they've increased in performance pretty dramatically. And we're not just building chips, we're building supercomputers. So here are the 10 lessons we learned over that decade. And I've broken them into 5 lessons about neural networking models, and then 5 lessons about hardware and architecture in general. The first is these models. This, we're early in this kind of deep learning revolution, and these models are growing fast. They grow about a factor of 1.5 per year in both memory footprint and in computation requirements. That was for inference. For training, it's growing even faster. Perhaps at the very state of the art, it's growing a factor of 10 per year. You've heard about GPT-3 in the news, and the big idea for 3 versus 2 was to be bigger. It's more than 100 times as many parameters, and it started doing really interesting things. Second lesson is these are very fast changing models. They're not the same workload that barely changes year after year. So, for example, this at the bottom here, the BERT model, which is a transformer model, that paper was published, the paper on it was published in 2018, right? And then 2 years later, it was a quarter of all of Google's workload. So it's amazingly fast changes to the workload. And then you get to not only, traditionally computer architecture, where can you innovate? You can innovate in the hardware and the architecture or in the compiler, but here you can also actually change the source. You can change the models themselves. So we use what's a neural architecture search is searching the space and a particular version of it that improved performance by a factor of 1.6 in one example. So the compiler and hardware was changed, but just the model was changed to adapt it to run better on that hardware. Whoops, I went a little bit too far. One of the things for inference is you're often dealing with customers, and so there's often a service level agreement, SLO, to make sure you deliver. Now you read some of the papers and they say batch size, which is this thing you do to kind of amortize the accesses to make the hardware run more efficiently. You have to keep it low to have the lowest latency. Well, that's true, but you don't have to keep it to batch size 1. It's a time limit, and there's a time constraint that's measured in milliseconds. So as you can see, we have pretty large batch sizes all the way up to 500 in one case, and still can meet this latency requirement. The final thing, which is pretty standard in CPUs, is you don't have to just run one program at a time. You can do multi-tenancy. You can run many programs and share the hardware. We need to do that for deep neural networks as well. And there's lots of examples of that. Like if you're translating, you can be translating many languages, so you have to have many models running, or you're rolling out new experimental versions. And our 8 benchmarks that we use, we looked at it, and their total memory footprint to see if you could fit it inside of a chip is no. You need to be able to switch between memory. Typically, 300 or 500 megabytes is typical what people would have on chip today, on a pretty big chip, and you still have to swap off the chip. That's our 5 lessons about deep neural networks. The first lesson about the hardware is paraphrasing the Bill Clinton presidential campaign in the US. It's the memory stupid. People often quote the peak floating point performance, but that's very easy to do. It's very hard to get a lot more memory performance. In modern chips, you're limited by energy, not transistors. Things started getting warmer, 15 years ago. And so when you look at it from an energy perspective, you see that an external memory access is 100 times more energy than an on-chip memory access, DRAM versus SRAM. And compared to an arithmetic operation, an external memory access is 10,000 times more energy. So what we've done, since we're energy limited and we have to do DRAM accesses, to go with we put a lot more arithmetic units in to amortize that the energy spent on the memory access. Now, the way we do that is to resuscitate an idea that had been around since the late 1970s called systolic array. What it's doing is a 2D choreographing of data arrival, and it allows to do operations like matrix multiply very efficiently. It was originally invented to keep things smaller due to the limited number of metal layers, but now we have a lot more metal layers. It not only did it keep things smaller, it also uses much less energy today. So that's why it's big use of systolic arrays. Over time, it also maps really well to the to transistors, to the logic transistors. So over the generations, we've been able to increase the number of matrix multiply units from 1 to 4. What a lesson going back to the RISC days is the importance of the compiler. This brand new deep neural networks, there aren't standard compilers you can just get off the shelf and use. So Google invented one they call XLA, and it does, it's amazing amount of sophistication. It divides the tasks into things that are machine independent and machines dependent. So the machine independent ones can work on not just on TPUs, but GPUs and CPUs. And the amount of parallelism they take on is really impressive. There's multi-core parallelism. Our biggest system that we've announced has 4,000 chips in it. So you want to take advantage of the multi-core parallelism. Within a processor, there's data level parallelism. There's two-dimensional matrix units and vector units. And you want to use those efficiently. That's up to the compiler. We have what's called very long instruction words. They have, depending on the generation, can be up to 400 bits wide. So there's lots of operations going on within a single instruction word. And so some of the challenges is new challenges, is two-dimensional vector registers. You have to have really good layout. The compiler's good layout, both in memory and in the units, to make sure everything runs efficiently. There's no caches in this system. That's typical on domain-specific architectures. The compiler's job is to manage all the transfers of memory and keep everything busy and to get good efficiency at the memory system. And this is pretty new stuff. Compilers take a long time to mature. How fast are they improving? Well, one of the things that we did in collaboration with other companies was to create benchmarks so that the whole industry could use, so we could measure performance. The standard is called ML-Perf. It's been around for a while now. And here shows the improvements early on that are about 15 months apart between two generations of the same GPU and TPU, but more efficient, better compiler. So the compilers improved, but the hardware is the same. And in both cases, the compilers were able to double the performance, which is amazing. So this is the 10 lessons that I told you about, and how do we apply them to our TPUs? Well, they grow rapidly in memory compute. So each generation, we increase the size of the supercomputers that we call pods by 4x. The performance doubles per chip, and we double the capacity of the memory technology we use, which is called high bandwidth memory, or HBM. The workloads evolve with breakthroughs. Remember, we told you about BERT. Well, we try to make it easier to program each time, to take out obstacles that make it easy for hardware to adapt easier for the compiler to adapt to the model. You get to optimize the model as well. We take advantage of that. We do use tailor models to make it run well on the hardware and the compiler. The limit is latency, kind of worst case latency, not batch size. So we're able to have batch sizes that make the hardware run better. And then we support multi-tenancy by having really fast memory off the chip. It's the memory system. We have 100,000, amazingly, 100,000 arithmetic units to amortize that energy. So, but that memory system is the real bottleneck is. We try and be optimized by being flexible. So we used to have dedicated function units in the first TPU. Instead, nowadays we have more programmable vector units. We've been these logic. I didn't mention it, but the logic in SRAM improves differentially, but the logic improves the best. So we were able to double the number of MXUs. And we maintain compiler compatibility by having a similar instruction set architecture. And I didn't talk about it, but rather than aiming for just performance, we aim for performance over total cost of ownership. Okay, so that was the 10 lessons. Then let me shift gears and talk about carbon emissions. Global climate change is a big problem facing everybody in the world. A lot of concerns were raised about whether all of the growth in training also means a large impact. I got started in this by looking at this article that appeared in IEEE about a year and a half ago. This is Spectrum, which is the flagship publication of IEEE. And this article said they kind of extrapolated into the future and tried to guess what would happen if they improved the quality of the model, of an existing model. And they said it would cost $100 billion and produce as much carbon emissions as the city of New York in a month. So that is a shocking result. I asked my friends in machine learning, I'm not an expert in machine learning, what they thought of that, and they didn't think they believed it, but they didn't have a response. So that I got involved in that. And not only was this a shocking result, 3 months later, this white paper came out that extrapolated again into the future, assuming nothing changes given current trends. Suppose we were trying to see what it would look like in 2 more years, and they said it would cost more than the total domestic product in the US up $20 trillion. Imagine what the environmental impact if you spent $20 trillion to train one model. So these are kind of shocking claims that were going on, which is why we try to work in there. And what these claims reminded me of a cartoon I'd seen. This comic, it's called XKCD, he's a clever guy who understands engineering. So what his comic is about is over time on a log scale, let's see what happens assuming nothing changes. So he looked at the word sustainable. And in the present day, and if it keeps going at this rate, 15 years into the future, on a log scale, the word sustainable would appear once per page of English text. If we make the same extrapolation, assuming nothing changes, 40 years from now, it'd appear once per sentence. And then 90 years from now, all of English text would just be the word sustainable repeated over and over again. So the cartoonist conclusion is the word sustainable is unsustainable. But my conclusion, it just illustrates kind of the dangers of assuming on a log scale that nothing changes and things keep going as they are. This is this Malthusian kind of prediction. Okay. So let me now dive into and see what really happened. So we're talking about operational energy use, not life cycle or embodied use. So it's you already have the hardware and you're using it. We're not talking about the cost of making it. The cost of making it, called embodied cost, that's a really interesting topic, but that'll be for another day. And we're just talking about emissions. Responsible AI is this broad topic. There's all kinds of issues. We're just talking about the environmental impact. And now one of the units we're going to use is this TCO2E. So what does that stand for? So the T is for ton, metric ton, 1,000 kilograms. And what's the E in CO2E? That's equivalent emissions. So that includes greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous dioxide. Okay. So how do we calculate energy use and carbon dioxide equivalent emissions? Well, the energy use is the first part, and it's this 4 factors. How long does it take to train? And things take hours or days or weeks for the big models. How many processors are you using? They can be, some things trained with hundreds or even thousands of processors. Then you just calculate the average power per processor, and that's how much energy the computers are using. But computers have to be in a data center. There's a last factor. This last factor is called in the industry power usage effectiveness, and it's how much energy is going to your computer. Well, how much gets lost between going into the data center and getting the computer because of the inefficiencies of power distribution and also to cool the data center. So if your overhead on top of what's close to the computer was 50%, then the PUE would be 1.5. Okay, so those are the 4 factors you multiply together. Ideally, you measure the average power while it's running, or you could extrapolate what some other people have done. And then this PUE number, Google and Facebook publish it, but you could just ask the data center operator what it is. That's energy. What about emissions? Well, then you just multiply the energy by this factor, which is the tons of carbon dioxide and equivalent emissions per kilowatt hour or per megawatt hour. And the only way you really can do that is just ask the data center operator what it was. Google publishes the percentage of carbon-free energy, which is close to it, but it's not quite the same thing. Okay. Now, to make this easy to remember our results, we came up with mnemonic, which is called the 4 M's, the 4 M's of energy efficiency. So the good news after these, Malthusian projections of, billions or trillions of dollars spent to train a model is over time, we can make things better. We can reduce the energy by 100x and reduce the carbon emissions by 1,000x. And to explain how we do this, we're going to use our 4 M's. The first M is the model itself. So like I said, remember, you can change the model. It's not just that the model is frozen. So my colleagues at Google found a model that was just as good in terms of quality as Transformer, but it was 4 times faster, and it's called Primer. So they did what's called a neural architecture search to find a better model. So that's the first M. And then we're talking about 4 years later, right? So over 4 years, what happened? Did it get a lot worse? or got better. It got 4 times better just for the model. The second factor is the hardware, or what we call the machine. So compared to kind of a generic GPU in 2017 to the latest TPU 4 years later, there's another factor of 14. You multiply that together, and it's 57 times less energy and emissions. That's the second M. The third M is a stretch to kind of turn it into an M, what's called mechanization, and it's that PUE factor. So typically, cloud data centers have very efficient new large data centers, and so compared to the average on-premise data center, which is often smaller and older, there's another factor of 1.4, so now we're up to 80. So a factor of 80 reduction over 4 years compared to the original transformer, thanks to from going from an on-premise data center to the Google Cloud, or probably any cloud. Now, the last M is maps, and that was the biggest surprise to us, is that there was huge differences in the cleanliness of the energy depending on the geographic location. So even, it can be a factor of 10 even within the same country. So in this case, compared to the average, compared to where Primer was trained at Google, it was a factor of 9. So you multiply that up, and so it's a factor of 80 less energy and a factor of 750 less emissions 4 years later. Not a lot worse, but a lot better. So these large language models are in the news these days all the time. I'm sure you've played with ChatGPT-3, which is one of these large language models. So all the people in machine learning when GPT all started, they wanted to have their own version of GPT-3. So one of these examples is GLAM that was done at Google. So the inventors of GLAM said, we're better than GPT-3. How are they better? Well, they actually have even more parameters. They have even more than 1 billion parameters, and GPT-3 has 175 billion. Well, so that's, what is that? That's a factor of 7 more parameters. Now, you would think it would take a lot longer to train with 7 times as many parameters, but they did what's called a mixture of experts model. So rather than invoking all 100% of the 175 billion parameters for every token, you only activate 8% of the billion parameters. So that ends up reducing the computation time by a factor of 3 and the energy by a factor of 3. Now, finally, because ChatGPT-3 was trained in a place with pretty much average energy, and Primer was trained in a place with cleaner energy, there is another factor of about 5. So overall, it's a factor of 14 less. So 18 months after GPT-3, another large language model was published, and it wasn't tremendously worse. It was 14 times less emissions. Okay, so that's good news number 1. Good news number 2, because I was giving these talks and people asked, well, how much of Google's energy goes to machine learning? And we were able to figure that out. We looked at the same month over 3 years, starting in 2021 and looking backwards in time. And at Google, because we can separate the types between TPUs and GPUs, CPUs, virtually all training is done on TPUs and some on GPUs. Now, for inference phase, after you train the model, again, most of it is done in TPUs and GPUs, but a little bit is done in CPUs. So we had to figure that out. And Google keeps track of all the library use over time, so we're able to figure that out in reverse. So surprisingly, each year for each of those 3 years, 2019 through 2021, the energy use was between 10 and 15%. Now, the energy grows as Google adds customers, it uses more energy every year. But the fraction that went to machine learning stayed pretty much constant between 10 and 15%. There's this idea that in some environmental circuit called Jevons paradox, it said if you make it more efficient, you'll just use more of it. That's a theory. It didn't happen in this case. The fraction that went, we are using more, but it's not growing faster than all our other use. And by the way, of the machine learning use, about 10 or 50 cents, 3/5 of it was for inference and 2/5 energy. Now, when we first started sharing these results, there was a grad student at Stanford say, well, if it's only 10 or 15% of all the energy, then I'm going to study something else. That's not very significant. But remember what I said is flops are easy to put in there. So it's actually, they were 70 to 80% of the flops because it's very easy to put flops in hardware. It's hard to do the memory system, but it was only 10 or 15% of the memory. Presumably, had we not built TPUs and we're doing everything on CPUs, it would be 70 to 80% of the flops and 70 to 80% of the energy. But because we built special purpose hardware, it's much more modest. Okay, now setting up this third time, I'm going to talk about a result that I don't know if you've heard of, but it's a pretty common phrase, and I just checked it by doing Google search. How much does it take to train a model versus cars? And this popped up on Google search if you search for it. That training a model can emit as much carbon as the lifetime of 5 cars. So that's quite a bit. So where did that number come from? So I'll tell you the story after that. So first thing to say is, like I started this off, global climate change is really important. It's important for everybody, but we got to get the numbers right to make sure you're working on the biggest challenges. So kind of for me, a little bit awkwardly, I'm going to tell you this story, and as part of the story, I'm going to point out errors in work by younger people, but we got to get the numbers right. So I'm going to share the mistakes, even though it's a little bit impolite. So concerns were rightly raised about carbon emissions, machine learning. That was a good thing to work on. And there was a group at the University of Massachusetts here in the United States who wanted to figure out this work that was done at Google to do a neural architecture search for a better model than Transformer. It wasn't Primer, it was an older model. Now that paper at that time in 2019 didn't include any emissions information. So the University of Massachusetts group wanted to figure out what it is. So they did an estimate for the searching for a model. So neural architecture search is where you use machine learning to find a better model, right? And then once you get that better model, typically what is done in the community is you put it into open source so everybody can use your model, and then you train it. But there's searching for the model and training it. Those are separate steps. This is a very popular paper. As of a few months ago, it was 1,600 times. It's probably 2,000 times now. Well, they didn't have access to the 4 M's for Google, so they did it on their own. They used the P100 instead of the TPU. They used US averages for some of the other M's. So not surprisingly, they're more efficient at Google, and so they're about a factor of 5 too high because of that, which, no big surprise there. However, they misunderstood the Google search results. They thought this searching process that Google did was using the full-size model to search the space. Well, advances were made in neural architecture search to make it more efficient so you could search a wider area. So they use a small proxy to search the space, and once they found something good, then they use the full-size model. So that meant their estimate was a factor of 19 too high because they misunderstood how the search was done, plus another 5 because they didn't have the 4 M's. So it was off by 88x, almost 100x. And that, unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. Some of the papers that started citing this result got confused about whether the estimate was for searching for the model or for the training of the model that was finally discovered. And the reason that matters is the searches are done rarely, and training happens all the time. And training is 1,300 times more emissions than searching for the model. So when we add that together, so it's 5 for not having the right 4 M's, 19 for misunderstanding search, and then these other people, assuming the search was training, it's off by 120,000, which is remarkable. So it's only 2.4 kilograms, not almost 250,000 kilograms. And it's this tiny fraction of a car lifetime, not 5 car lifetimes. And it turns out, I mentioned the primer model, it was also trying to improve Transformer. So it's another factor of 11. So it's actually the state of training a Transformer-like model in 2021 is basically 1,000,000 times less than what some people thought. So let me wrap up before I go to questions. So here are these 10 lessons. And one of the big things to remember if you're interested in machine learning is floating point operations, that peak performance is not a good predictor. That we were able, by having special purpose hardware, to keep the energy low despite it dominating the computation. So recommendations around these 4 M's, right, is, well, it's important that we're not done with machine learning. We can make it a lot better, and there's huge demand for it. So not only should you do better quality, but keep making it more efficient, which can help with factors of 2 to 4. And focus on, my advice is try and minimize, if you want to run fast, focus on memory accesses rather than floating point operations. And then it's just good practice is to publish your energy consumption and carbon footprint, because we've seen if other people calculated it, it can be off by quite a bit. And also we want to have a competition so that we get these ML people competing on efficiency as well as accuracy. Keep building faster machines. The latest GPUs, TPUs, each generation has gains of factors of 2 to 4. If you're interested in the hardware, you know, one of the big challenges is can you do sparse models efficiently? And if in the future, you know, talking about the embodied costs, not just the operational costs. The data center efficiency is already very efficient. Typical data centers are 1.1, so there's only 10% overhead. But, you know, keep using those efficient data centers. And it's helpful to publish the efficiency. And the final one, and actually the easiest one to use, the easiest thing to do in the cloud is to change the location. So just be aware of which data center you use to try and pick the data centers that have the cleanest energy. And this can make these even larger differences than the other ones. Google's has published its results, and I think as of last year, there were 2 sites in Europe and 3 in the US that were about 90% carbon-free energy. So those would be the ones to use. And then if we co-optimize these 4 M's that I mentioned here, we can deliver on this amazing potential of machine learning, which is very exciting, to help a lot of fields, but do it in a sustainable manner. And for my last slide, I will thank all the many Googlers who built the hardware that I'm talking about. Okay, with that, I am ready for some questions. And if we run out of questions, I will tell you my life story advice, but let's see if there's questions. But I need the first question, and I need to see if I can hear the questions. Hello?
Just a second, sir. Yeah, Professor Patterson had to sign in from a different account to speak out. I hope that's not an issue. Yeah, so thank you for addressing this beautiful talk with a beautiful presentation. We have a few questions. I hope we have sufficient time to discuss those out.
Okay.
Yeah, just one second. So the first question, of late, inferencing the machine learning models has been of great significance, and experts of deep learning theory are actively researching on it. As a professor from computer architecture, what are your views on difficulty of inferencing these models on edge devices?
On edge devices? Yeah, well, the same. So it's interestingly, the two most exciting, to me, the two most exciting parts of computing is the cloud and the edge. And they have similar challenges. The cloud is energy limited for reasons I talked about, and the edge, which is almost always battery operated, is also energy limited. So energy efficiency is very important on both ends. So domain, and if you're going to do machine learning on the edge, you want to use special purpose processors as well, because that'll be the most energy efficient way to do machine learning. So I haven't been working on machine learning for the edge for, and then like the questioner said, it'll be inference. You won't, it's very unlikely to do training on the edge. You'll do inference on the edge. So I think that's a very exciting area to work on, where you can have big impact. And, the edge has all kinds of devices, from phones that most of us carry around to IoT devices. So I think there's big opportunities on the edge for special purpose hardware around machine learning. I think it's an exciting thing to work on. There's a lot of work in this area. So you should be, read up on everything that people have done, but it's going to be remaining important topic.
Thank you for that response. Also, another question. So recently, companies like Google and Microsoft are trying to integrate their large language models with the search. What are the challenges in terms of costs or emissions you think will come up to deploy these on the scale?
Yeah, so that's a very big topic today. If you read the news, the newspapers said that Sundar Pichai, the CEO, called code red, which is kind of an emergency inside of Google because of the possibility these large language models would be used instead of searching, that you'd talk to them, kind of have a dialogue with them rather than just type in your questions and see what comes back. So that's, it's a very interesting time. I think probably every couple of years over my whole career, I say, wow, these are interesting times. But right now, the large language models are extraordinarily expensive. They do amazing things, but they're extraordinarily expensive. So how in the world can you afford to serve this model to millions or billions of people since it's so expensive? So that's a challenge that Google and Microsoft are trying to figure out how to do. So the good news is if you're a researcher, I think there's times where companies are pretty happy how things are going and not that excited about changing what they have because they don't want to take any risks. Now is a time that companies are really motivated to accept risks and try new ideas. So I don't know that anybody knows what's the best way to do this, but it's a really important problem, and they're spending lots of time and money trying to figure it out, as we speak. So it couldn't be a more relevant topic. So if you've got a great idea how to serve large language models, more cost effectively, there's going to be a lot of interest in it.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. Also, we have one last question. So for someone working on machine algorithms, what would be your advice to researchers about improving the efficiency of the models? Because algorithms have there are very less hardware constraints right now, and what would be your suggestion?
Yeah, I tried to mention that. I would say, first of all, in terms, like I said, people kind of understandably, when they're writing papers doing machine learning algorithms, will often use this model is more efficient because it uses fewer floating point operations. Unfortunately, that's not a dependable predictor of performance, because it's pretty easy to make the floating point performance go up without changing the energy. The really hard challenge is the memory accesses. So my advice would be, if you're trying to just explore the space without actually running on hardware and measuring it, I would try and reduce memory. I would count memory accesses and see if you can reduce that. Now, not all memory accesses are equal, but that's probably a better guideline than floating point operations. Secondly, when we talk about these large language models in particular, I think the hope is that you could find sparse versions so that they would have, you want to be able to have that quality without as many parameters in them. So the GPT-3 went up by a factor of 100 to 200 billion parameters about, and people are in the tens of billions to hundreds of billions parameters for these large language models. So what's a good idea? Maybe sparsity. Maybe you don't need to access all of that. The actual training itself, right now we always start off with random numbers. Maybe you could do some pre-training and get the really good results. So that would be the examples of advice. And I just encourage you, when you publish, is to run it on hardware and to record, how much energy you used and try to estimate how much emissions you used, so that we can be doing these compare results when we're looking at new algorithms and make these decisions. Okay, if that's the last question. Do you have more questions?
We have one last question from the audience. I hope you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
I think I can hear that.
Okay, I guess I'm not visible on camera. So I have two questions. So first one is you mentioned that the memory is the most energy consuming part of the process. So how is it different in a GPU and TPU?
No, it's about the same. Both. If you look at them, the kind of inside the processors, they're very different, but the memory systems are identical. All of them use HBM memory. These high bandwidth memories are in stacks, and there's multiple stacks. And amazingly enough, there's thousands of pins, thousands of wires going from the HBM stacks to the processor, and that's how you get a lot of bandwidth. But both the GPU designers and TPU designers decided to use the same memory system. So in that aspect, they're very similar. Inside the chip, they're quite different, but the memory systems are almost identical.
Well, then how is the energy consumption so different? Like you mentioned 14 times improvement, right?
Oh, yeah, over time. But that's, there was two issues there. It was the fact that there were TPUs versus GPUs, but the big difference there was time. It was a 2017 GPU versus a 2021 TPU. So likely a 2021 GPU also would have been, say, factor of 10 better. In particular, that particular GPU from 2017 was before NVIDIA started putting in optimizations for machine learning. That was just a generic graphics processing unit that was designed for graphics. Later, they started putting in enhancements for machine learning. So that's why it was a factor of 14.
Oh, okay. Another question. So, is the ChatGPT and the GPT-3 and the GLAM portable on other hardware? Because, like right now, we were comparing on different hardware, right? So, how do we understand like which ML model is better?
Yeah, I understand the question. Yeah, it's a lot of work to get these models working, but I can tell you the ML Perf, this benchmarking effort, they're trying to do the right thing. And one of the things that's bad about benchmarking is that the benchmarks get old and out of date, then you don't have the latest model. So ML Perf's plan for this May, so that's 3 months from now, the next generation of ML Perf is going to have a large language model in it, and that will be portable. And that everybody who competes is going to run the same large language model, so you'll be able to see a head-to-head comparison. So the May results for ML Perf, you'll be able to see that. And if you were if you were interested in that space, I think you can start. I think just about anybody can start participating if you're interested in ML Perf. You may be able to get early access to that model that they're considering if you want to try and play with it yourself. But if you're interested in architecture to architecture comparisons, I would find out a lot more about ML Perf to see how to do that.
Oh, so these models are portable on different hardware. So like
it's not. I mean, yes and no. They're implemented in some language. It's either TensorFlow or PyTorch or JAX, and it's not easy to port them. It can be a lot of work to port them, but they are portable.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Professor Patterson, would you be willing to take one more question?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, sir. I'm a MS student here, and my research involves developing a vector architecture to speed up ML and stuff. And initially, our work is involving to speed up ML algorithms like lane detection, even the edge and stuff. Lane detection algorithms and all.
I see. Okay.
And one of the biggest challenge I have is to go with the RISC-V vector extension or the Go processor. And can you give some suggestions the direction on which way I can go?
Yeah. See if I heard that. It's the obstacle was the going over the interface between the coprocessor and the processor. That's one of the big ones. Is that what you said?
As an architecture implemented as a coprocessor or the RISC-V vector extension.
Should it be implemented as a coprocessor or as a unified architecture? Is that the question?
No. How can I say?
Well, vectors are okay. I think I follow that. because you can do the vector processor as a coprocessor as well. But basically, I think it gets to having being more tightly integrated with the processor. So I think I don't think there's any there's some practical reasons to implement it as a coprocessor, in that there's a bunch of software that already runs on the processor. So there's some, but I don't think there's any. If anything, it's a negative to do a coprocessor versus integrated with the processor. There may be opportunities that if you did some things in the CPU and DPU and go back and forth, that when they're integrated together, that you don't have when it's a coprocessor. So there's the practical advantages. From a research perspective, I wouldn't necessarily pick a coprocessor, but you might want to explore the benefits. What do you gain by having the processor, the vector processor, near each other versus having a processor and a separate coprocessor, and see how much better it is with them unified rather than divided.
Yeah, that's one thing, but it is a lot of time, effort, and
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I tell you, it's hard. It can be hard to do research. I would say it also depends what you're looking at. Certainly, in the embedded space, I think it's less likely to be a coprocessor, and it's easier to have it more tightly integrated because it's all in one system on a chip, right? There's one chip that all the pieces are on, so it's pretty easy to keep it as part of a vector processor there.
okay, thanks.
All right. Let me go ahead and tell you my life story here. So I'd start off with, these are the books I wish I had read when I was a grad student. Well, a lot of them didn't exist, but the first one is Authentic Happiness. Is kind of what's guided my life is decisions that make me happy. And you grow up in the United States and you think the way to be happy is to be wealthy, right? And so what I've learned is there's a lot of unhappy wealthy people today. So just because you're wealthy doesn't mean you're happy. So why not just be goal directly? And this book talks about happiness. And basically, for many years, psychologists just worried about crazy people and why are people crazy. But then he said, well, why don't we see why people are happy? And so they have studied that, and there's things you could try, like importance of having friends, importance of having exercise, importance of a spiritual side, and things like that. The second book here is a very old book, but it's advice on how to lead and persuade people. People haven't changed very much, even though the book's pretty old. So advice is really good. In fact, I just reread that a couple of months ago, and the advice is still really good. The third thing is, especially if you're a grad student, it can take a long time to get a PhD. Well, if you learn to be more productive, you could shave time off that grad student's career. After you graduate and you become, whatever you do, go into industry or go into academia, you're going to become a manager. And this very slim book is 1 Minute Manager. It gives you advice on the difference between managing the people who report to you and managing up, dealing with your bosses. And it's a good advice. And finally, my favorite book is this very tiny book by Strunk and White on how to write effectively in English. And the advice is so small, they made the book small because brevity is one of his favorite things. Okay. Now, what works for me over my career? Family first. When I was graduating from college, once I got the job from Berkeley, I still had some time to think about it because I hadn't finished my PhD. And I realized that these are very time-consuming jobs, and you can spend, and they're really interesting too, and it's very demanding. So you can spend all your time in this and shut your family out. So I didn't want that to happen. And so when when you have children, young, when they're little kids, when they're delightful, but they eventually grow up to be teenagers. And when they were young, I went on. I did all the volunteer activities I could as Indian Guides and Cub Scouts in the United States, and I was their football coach, assistant football coach, and all kinds of things. And when they became teenagers, they said, "Dad, you were never around." Then I went over the list: Indian Guides, Cub Scouts. Oh, okay, Dad, you're still around. So my sons have grown up, and now we have grandkids, and the family's very tight. In fact, where I live, one is what how do I do this in meters? Maybe 500 meters away from my house, and one of them I can see the house right now. It's like 10 meters away, so we're close together. I'm really glad that happened. Passion and courage. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm pretty a passionate person, and ironically, when I was in high school and college, I was a wrestler, so kind of the physical courage that comes up with wrestling translates for me into intellectual courage. So when we're working on a research project, I have to believe it's a research project that could change the world, and so we really want to do it, and we're enthusiastic about it, and that's served me well. If you know Star Trek, if you know old Star Trek, I kind of look like this character, Sir Patrick Stewart. Let's see, kind of like that. See, but in Star Trek terms, he was a captain, very intellectual. But I'm probably more like Captain Kirk, who was always getting into fights and always laughing. Okay. And then in using baseball terms, maybe, I don't know if this works in cricket. Anyways, I swing to hit the ball a long way rather than just barely make contact and get on base. One of my, given I'm passionate and in courage, one of my advisors told me this saying that comes from long ago: friends may come and go, but enemies accumulate. So basically that advice is pointing out that if you remember people maybe earlier friends you had when you were younger and you kind of drifted apart, but if you make an enemy, they never forget you and they stick around for life. So so pick your enemies carefully, basically, because they're not going away. So I think I didn't kind of consciously, I only had a couple of people I picked public fights with. One of them was the head of a government agency, and I thought he was cutting back funding of U.S. academic research, and so I kind of took him on publicly. And the good news about that, he was definitely an enemy and was kind of vengeful in terms of cutting off funding. But the upside is a lot of people didn't like the guy, so kind of the enemy of my enemy was my friend was kind of worked. So, but anyways, pick your enemies carefully here. Winning as a team and individual, even though as a wrestler, which is an individual sport, my high school and college coaches believed that if we bonded as a team, we'd be more successful. So I kind of believe in my DNA that teams can win over outstanding individuals, and I've tried to figure out ways to create teams that can work well together. One of the phrases, this was from Fred Brooks, a Turing award winner who has sadly recently passed away. One of his phrases, there's no losers on a winning team and no winners on a losing team. So that if you win, no matter what you are doing, you're part of the winning. But if you lose, that no matter how, you can't benefit from it. I think one of the things I've tried to do in my career is to send my paper out to people while we're working on it to get feedback and learn from that. I think that's one of my strengths. And particularly if you have people who don't agree with you, well, you really want to get their feedback because they'll give you the honest feedback about it. So kind of I realize there's a corollary about this that I've learned. And it'll take me a while to explain the story, but it's very dangerous if one of the people you think you're going to work with thinks he's the smartest person in the room. So why do I think that? Well, over my lifetime, there's been a handful of examples. One was a person in my field, computer architecture. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He's a very unpopular guy in the field. A lot of people don't like him. There was a president of Harvard University, one of the most famous universities around, and he thought he was the smartest person in the room, and he was eventually fired from his job. There was an energy company out of Texas, United States, called Enron, and both their founder and president are convicted felons. And my last example is the brother of an ex-brother-in-law of mine thought he was the smartest person in the room, and he's a convicted felon. But what's the flaw here? It wasn't that they're not smart. I think what the flaw was is they thought they were so smart, they didn't need to get feedback on their ideas. Well, if I'm smarter than everybody here, what can they tell me that I don't know? And then that means you avoid feedback and you make these terrible mistakes that get you fired or put you in jail. Okay. And then the next advice is, I still remember maybe 5 or 10 years into my career, maybe 10 years into my career, that I woke up one morning and it was like God spoke to me, and he said, I realized it's not how many projects you, exactly this phrase was stuck in my mind. It's not how many projects you start, it's how many you finish. So in general in life, but in particular as a professor, there's all kinds of things going on. But after I had that aha moment, I made sure I only did one big thing at a time. I'd do other small things, but only one big thing at a time. So when John Hennessy and I wrote our textbook, you know, that was the big thing that was going on that year. When I was chair of the Department of Computer Science at Berkeley, that was my big thing. When I was president of ACM, that was a big thing. So I would get, every year I would not do more than one big thing at a time. So what that means is over a career of 40 years, you can get a lot of things done. You know, you can get 30-ish things done. So people think I was very productive, but I think really I was just a lot more selective in what I took on to only do one at a time. And the final one is that the final piece of advice is I'm a natural born optimist. And so my example comes from my youth, is when I was 16 and in high school, I was just starting to date. And one of the girls I started to date, I really liked her. So I asked her just after a couple of dates if she would be exclusive with me. At the time, we used the term going steady. So I asked her if she'd go steady. And she looked at me, and she had dated more than I had, and we were only 16. So what she said to me was, well, Dave, I don't know how to say no. So to me, as an optimist, she said, and a logical person, not a no is a yes. So I said, great, and hugged her. And in her mind, she thought, well, I'll let him down later, more gently. But we've now been married for 55 years, so my optimism worked. All right. And this is a picture of me, us then, and us more recently. So when you've been married that long, people want to know what the secret of a long marriage is. I'm going to tell you that secret, how to have a long-lasting relationship. And what you have to learn is 9 magic words that both partners have to be willing to say. And here's the 9 magic words. And to help you make it easy to remember, here's 3 of them. They start off, there's 3 sentences, I, you, I. And what are the 9 magic words? I was wrong. You were right. And the last one's not popping up, but the last one is I love you. All right. I was wrong. You were right. I love you. So you have to say all the words. You can't, no substitutions. I was wrong. You were right. You're a jerk. No, you can't say that. So if you follow this advice, you can have a long-lasting relationship, and if along with being optimistic about it. All right. Thanks very much. I think we're right done on time.
Thank you very much. It's really a great experience hearing your personal experiences as well as an insightful talk on the entire topic. And thank you very much for patiently answering all the questions that we had. It was a great pleasure having you, and we thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thanks. It was fun giving the talk. Bye.
Thank you.